A silent woman enters a crowded courtroom, but as whispers ripple through the room, no one realizes she holds the key to toppling a web of corruption that's entangled cops, judges, and city officials for years. Stay until the end to uncover how her quiet entrance explodes into a truth so powerful it silences those who thought they controlled her fate. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move, you challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The courtroom in Atlanta's bustling civic district thrummed with a low hum of anticipation, the kind of uneasy energy that preceded something seismic, though no one yet knew it. Among the murmurs, the clatter of pens against paper, and the occasional cough, sat a woman whose presence drew no overt attention, but whose silence commanded the space like an approaching storm. Janelle Rhodes sat still, her slender frame poised but relaxed, her dark curls pulled back into a low twist, her eyes shielded behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple navy suit, tailored but unremarkable, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But beneath that composed exterior, a fire coiled waiting. Across the aisle, Officer Blake Harlow leaned back in his chair, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. His laugh cut through the muted buzz like a blade, sharp and dismissive, as he exchanged low remarks with his colleague. "Who let the help in?" he muttered, jerking his chin toward Janelle. "Probably thinks she's somebody important sitting there like she owns the place." His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It sliced into the space between them, eliciting a few snickers from the officers seated nearby. Janelle didn't flinch. She didn't even glance in his direction, but those who noticed the clerk at the edge of the bench, a junior lawyer, flipping through notes, registered the shift. It was subtle the way the air thickened, how even the judge paused ever so slightly before shuffling his papers. Janelle was no stranger to such remarks. She'd heard them in conference rooms, on city buses, in the whispers of colleagues who doubted her, in the unspoken glances of those who underestimated her. But what Blake Harlow, in his arrogance, failed to realize was that this wasn't just another day in court. This wasn't just another black woman sitting quietly, hoping not to attract attention. This was a woman who had spent years mastering the art of patience. A woman who had built her career on listening to what others dismissed, who had learned not to react, but to observe until the moment was hers. The trial underway was supposed to be routine, if there were ever such a thing. Another case of alleged police misconduct, another set of grainy video evidence and contradictory witness statements. But today was different. This time, the courtroom wasn't just a stage for a performance where victims were silenced and authority figures smirked behind their badges. This time, there was someone in the room who wasn't playing by their rules. Janelle's mind traveled back to the conversation she'd had with her late father, a civil rights lawyer who'd fought in courtrooms much like this one long before she'd been born. "Power doesn't crumble under force," he had told her once, his voice gravelly but steady. "It shatters under the weight of truth. But you have to wait until the weight is undeniable." She had carried those words with her through law school, through every late night, poring over case files, through every moment when she'd been told to be patient, to be quiet, to let things play out. Blake Harlow's smirk widened as he continued, his voice now just low enough for the words to carry, but not loud enough for the judge to reprimand him. She probably doesn't even know how to spell subpoena. He said, his tone mocking. More chuckles followed. The courtroom, though filled with people, felt like it had shrunk to a stage where one actor jeered and the other waited poised. But what no one knew, not the bailiff tapping his pen against his notepad, not the stenographer typing dutifully, not even the judge presiding from his elevated seat, was that Janelle Rhodes was not there as a mere observer. She wasn't a civilian drawn by curiosity or a distant family member called in as a reluctant witness. Janelle was there because she had orchestrated it. Every detail, every moment, every look was part of a careful plan, months, years in the making. As Blake's laughter rang out again, louder this time, a thin smile tugged at the corner of Janelle's mouth, not of amusement, but of knowing. The courtroom's temperature seemed to drop as if the walls themselves were listening. A faint tap echoed from the back of the room, where a federal agent posing as a plainclothes observer adjusted his earpiece. The silent signals were falling into place. Janelle's gaze flicked once imperceptibly toward the gallery, where a young man with a notepad scribbled hurriedly. Another undercover operative capturing every word. Blake didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the illusion of control, oblivious to the trap slowly closing around him. A shift in the energy rippled through the room as the judge cleared his throat, preparing to call the next witness. Blake leaned in closer to his colleague, his voice now a low growl. "She won't last 5 minutes up there. Probably break down before she can say her name." Janelle's heart beat steadily in her chest, not from fear, but from the weight of anticipation. She had seen this before, the arrogance of those who believed the system was theirs to manipulate, who thought their uniforms rendered them untouchable. What Blake didn't know, what no one in that room had even suspected, was that the woman he mocked wasn't just a witness. She was the architect. Every document in her briefcase was a weapon, every recorded conversation a thread in the net she had cast over the corruption that had seeped into the city's law enforcement and judiciary. The names, the dates, the signatures, all of it meticulously gathered. And Blake, with his careless smirks and his whispered slurs, had just handed her the final thread. When the judge called for the next witness and all eyes turned to the front of the courtroom, Janelle rose, not hurriedly, not with a show of indignation, but with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who knew that the game was already won. She adjusted her glasses, smoothed the front of her suit, and stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. The hush that fell over the courtroom was palpable. Even Blake, now half standing, froze as realization flickered in his eyes. For the first time that morning, his smirk faltered. The laughter died, and Janelle Rhodes, with the quiet power of accumulated truth, took her place not as a victim, not as a bystander, but as the woman who was about to shatter everything he thought he controlled. And she hadn't even spoken a word. The moment Janelle Rhodes stepped into the witness box, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted like a sudden change in weather. The air became heavy, expectant, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The murmurs in the gallery faded into silence. Even Blake Harlow's previously smug expression stiffened, his jaw tightening as the realization that something was amiss flickered in his eyes. But it was too late. Janelle stood with an unhurried grace, her hands resting lightly on the railing before her, her gaze fixed on the judge with a calm assurance that seemed almost out of place for someone ostensibly summoned as a witness. The judge, a wiry man with years of procedural experience, shifted uneasily in his seat, sensing something beneath the surface of this moment that he couldn't quite place. "I'm ready to proceed, Your Honor," Janelle said, her voice carrying with a clear, steady tone that left no room for interpretation. As the prosecutor approached, a subtle change overtook him. He no longer bore the harried look of someone navigating a routine trial, but instead carried a purposeful precision. His questions framed not for a typical testimony, but for the unveiling of something far greater. "Ms. Rhodes," he began, "could you please state your occupation for the record?" A pause followed a pause, weighted enough to draw every eye in the room. "I am a special investigator with the Department of Justice," she said, her voice unwavering. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by an electric silence. The judge's eyes widened. Blake's complexion blanched, his mouth opening as though to protest, but producing no sound. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing quick glances at one another. What had begun as a routine hearing was unraveling into something none of them had anticipated. Janelle continued, her words precise, each syllable carving through the courtroom's pretense like a scalpel. "For the past 18 months, I've been conducting a covert investigation into allegations of systemic corruption and abuse of power within the Atlanta Police Department and its affiliated judicial circuits. My assignment involved gathering evidence of misconduct, falsified records, and the suppression of justice by individuals in positions of authority." She allowed her gaze to sweep briefly over Blake, whose face was now a study in panic, barely restrained by the thin veneer of professionalism. "My role as a supposed witness was part of a strategic operation to observe behavior within this courtroom, under circumstances where certain individuals believed themselves immune to accountability." The prosecutor stepped back, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The judge, now visibly pale, cleared his throat and addressed Janelle directly. "Ms. Rhodes, are you prepared to submit evidence to substantiate these claims?" Janelle inclined her head once. "I am, Your Honor." The evidence includes audio recordings, video documentation, internal communications, and verified reports of misconduct involving specific officers, including but not limited to Officer Blake Harlow, and supporting actions by members of this court. At this, Blake shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," he bellowed, the confident mask he'd worn all morning now in full collapse. His voice cracked under the weight of desperation. "This is entrapment. She's lying. This is some kind of setup." The judge raised a hand, commanding silence, but the damage was done. The mask Blake had worn so effortlessly was now crumbling, revealing the raw fear beneath. His bravado had evaporated in an instant, replaced by the sudden sick realization that his unchecked arrogance had finally met a force greater than himself. Janelle remained unflinching, her gaze steady and implacable. "Officer Harlow," she said, her tone cool but cutting, "would you like to explain to the court why you found it appropriate to harass me earlier today? Or perhaps you'd like to discuss your involvement in the falsification of evidence tied to multiple ongoing cases, or the audio recordings where you describe manipulating case outcomes with the assistance of others." Blake opened his mouth again, but no sound emerged. His hands trembled, the thin sheen of sweat on his forehead catching the courtroom lights. For the first time, he appeared not as the confident enforcer of power, but as a man cornered by the truth, his authority reduced to nothing more than a trembling facade. The prosecutor interjected smoothly, reinforcing the momentum. Your Honor, we request that this evidence be formally entered into the record and that Officer Harlow be remanded into custody pending further investigation. The judge, his expression now a mask of resigned disbelief, nodded slowly. So ordered, he said, his voice subdued. As the bailiffs moved toward Blake, his protests grew louder, disjointed, frantic. You can't do this. I know people, I have connections. This is a setup. But his words fell flat against the rising tide of accountability, swallowed by the evidence already being displayed on the monitors lining the courtroom walls. Audio clips of his own voice, video snippets of backroom meetings, records of payments, and falsified reports. Janelle stood silent, letting the evidence speak. Every document, every recording, every carefully orchestrated detail was a piece of the puzzle she'd assembled over months of methodical work. She had anticipated Blake's every move, documented every lie, and prepared for every attempt to discredit her. But this moment wasn't just about Blake Harlow's downfall. It was about the cracks now visible in a system that had long shielded men like him from consequences. It was about the spectators in the gallery who were now witnessing not just the spectacle of a man's mask slipping, but the broader truth that justice, though often delayed, could not be silenced. As Blake was led from the courtroom, his shouts echoing futilely down the marble corridors, Janelle's gaze followed him, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, resolute purpose. This was only the beginning. The true depths of corruption extended far beyond one man's downfall, and she was prepared to face whatever storms lay ahead. Outside the courthouse, news cameras were already gathering their lenses, trained on the doors, as though waiting for the story to spill into the streets. But inside, in the courtroom, now hushed by the gravity of what had just unfolded, Janelle Rhodes remained standing, a quiet sentinel to the truth she had unleashed. The courtroom was left in stunned silence after Janelle Rhodes's revelations. But silence, as Janelle well knew, could be a fertile ground for truth to grow or for old power to claw back. As the murmurs in the gallery returned, like the cautious trickle of a stream after a storm, Janelle stood rooted in place, letting the moment breathe, letting the walls absorb the weight of her words. And then, with a grace sharpened by years of preparation, she spoke again, her voice slicing through the murk of disbelief. There is more, she said simply. The words weren't a threat, nor were they a boast. They were a quiet promise, a foreshadowing of the reckoning that had just begun. The judge, his face now a mixture of pale fear and conflicted authority, glanced at the documents on his bench, his hands twitching as if uncertain whether to touch them. He cleared his throat. Ms. Rhodes, please proceed. Janelle nodded. From her leather satchel, she produced a second envelope, heavier than the first. It landed on the clerk's desk with a sound like a gavel strike. Inside were meticulously collated files, internal memos, concealed reports, surveillance images, all cross-referenced with dates, locations, and the names of individuals whose hands had left fingerprints on corruption's mask. As the contents were displayed on the screen behind her, each file illuminated a pattern so intricate and deliberate it made the previous evidence seem like mere surface scratches. The images showed officers in backroom meetings exchanging sealed envelopes. Memos bore the signatures of influential figures, including not just Blake Harlow, but supervisors, district attorneys, even the judge now sitting stiffly at his bench. Janelle's voice, though calm, was now infused with an unshakable urgency. This system isn't broken by accident, she said. It's been maintained calculated to protect those who believe they are beyond reproach. The documents before you reveal a network of collusion that reaches far beyond this courtroom. A ripple of disbelief swept through the gallery, but it was quickly replaced by the grim acknowledgement that the veil had been lifted. Even those who had long suspected wrongdoing found themselves breathless at the scale of what was now revealed. Reporters scribbled furiously their pens, nearly ripping through notepads as they struggled to keep pace with the cascade of revelations. Blake Harlow, now seated handcuffed and flanked by bailiffs, sat slack-jawed, his earlier bravado dissolved into mute horror. The smirk that had once been his armor had vanished, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man caught in the web he helped spin. His eyes flickered toward the judge, seeking a lifeline, but found none. The judge's own face had turned to stone, his fingers tightening around the edges of his papers as though clinging to the last vestiges of control. Janelle's words continued to unfold the narrative. For the past year and a half, I've worked alongside a covert team of federal investigators and community advocates. We've documented evidence that implicates not only officers, but also members of the prosecution, senior administrators, and even individuals in positions of judicial authority. She turned her gaze directly to the judge. That includes, Your Honor. The judge recoiled, his mouth opening and closing as though words might shield him. But there were none left. The screen behind them displayed a transcript, his own words pulled from intercepted communications, promising to ensure the right outcomes for cases tied to key contributors and dismissing concerns about repeated misconduct from officers like Blake. Gasps erupted from the gallery. One woman, her voice cracking, whispered, "It's true. It's all true." The prosecutor, now visibly shaken but resolute, addressed the judge. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, we formally move for your recusal from this case and an immediate inquiry into your conduct. The judge hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for his gavel. But before he could speak, Janelle's voice rose not loud but powerful. Before you make any decision, she said, I'd like to call a witness. Someone who has seen firsthand how these abuses affected real lives. A quiet rustle as a door opened at the back of the courtroom. A man stepped forward, Joseph Fields, a community activist and former victim of wrongful arrest under Blake Harlow's authority. His face bore the tired, determined lines of a man who had waited years for justice. He took the stand, and his voice, rough but steady, filled the room. I was dragged from my home in front of my kids, he said, falsely accused. Evidence was tampered with. They told me no one would believe me, and for years no one did. But Ms. Rhodes, she believed me, and she showed me I wasn't alone. His testimony, raw and unvarnished, was a clarion call that resonated far beyond the marble walls of that courtroom. It echoed into the hearts of those present and rippled outward through the gallery, into the streets, into homes where people sat watching the news unfold in real time. His words didn't just confirm the evidence, they humanized it. They gave faces to the files, lives to the documents. When Joseph stepped down, Janelle faced the courtroom once more. This is not just about punishment, she said, her voice steady but fierce. It's about reclaiming integrity, about restoring faith in a system that has long favored silence over justice. It's about the countless voices who were dismissed, mocked, and discarded. A pause deep and reverent. It's about truth. The judge's gavel came down, then not with authority, but with resignation. Court will reconvene tomorrow for further proceedings, he said, his voice brittle. The bailiffs escorted Blake from the room, his steps heavy, his gaze unfocused. The judge remained seated, as if unable to rise, as though the weight of his own complicity had finally become too heavy to bear. As the courtroom emptied, Janelle remained standing, her spine straight, her resolve unbroken. She had known this day would come, the day when hidden rot would be dragged into the light, when the mask of untouchability would be torn away, revealing not just one man's guilt, but a system's collective shame. And yet, as she gathered her files and prepared to leave, she knew this was only the beginning. The truth had been unveiled, but justice was not yet served. There were still more names to uncover, more stories to tell, and more battles to fight. Janelle Rhodes sat alone in her dimly lit office, the weight of the day pressing against her shoulders like a silent, suffocating fog. The files sprawled across her desk were no longer just documents. They were echoes of a system long corrupted, each page whispering stories of shattered lives and hushed injustices. Though her courtroom revelations had ignited a firestorm of attention, the air around her was heavy with an unnerving quiet. It was the calm before the storm. The city outside still buzzed with protests, chants echoing off the high-rises as communities found their voices in unison. But within the walls of the courthouse and the corridors of power, silence had become a weapon. It was the silence of doors, closing of calls unanswered, of colleagues who once offered polite smiles, now avoiding her gaze. It was a silence thick with fear, fear of exposure, of accountability, of truth. As the evening wore on, Janelle's phone rang. She hesitated before answering, already knowing who it was. Rosa, her trusted investigator and ally, spoke with urgency. "They're scrambling," she said. "I've intercepted communication from several high-ranking officials. They're trying to pin the blame solely on Blake and the judge. They want to make it look like an isolated incident." Janelle closed her eyes, the frustration building behind her ribcage. "Of course they are," she murmured. "They think they can sacrifice two to save the many." Rosa hesitated, then added, "They're also trying to undermine you. There's talk of launching an inquiry into your conduct, questioning your methods, implying you fabricated evidence or acted out of personal vendetta." The words hit Janelle like a gut punch, though she had anticipated this. She let the silence hang for a beat before replying. "Let them come," she said quietly. "They'll only confirm what they fear most, that I'm not afraid of them." After hanging up, Janelle leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. The silence felt heavier now, thick with the knowledge of coming battles. But it wasn't just fear that settled over her. It was a deep, consuming resolve. She understood that real change was not born in a flash of revelation or a viral headline. It was forged in the relentless, quiet fight against those who wielded silence as a shield. The next morning, she stepped into the courthouse with a presence that belied the turbulence beneath her calm exterior. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras capturing every step she took, but Janelle ignored them. Her eyes were fixed forward, her jaw set with quiet determination. Inside the courtroom, buzzed with hushed conversations, whispers of speculation, fear, and disbelief. The judge, presiding in place of the disgraced one, a woman named Eleanor Vasquez, watched her with a gaze sharpened by curiosity and caution. Unlike her predecessor, Vasquez wasn't known for backroom dealings. She had a reputation for fairness, though tempered by pragmatism. As Janelle took her seat, she sensed the undercurrents of politics already swirling beneath the veneer of procedure. The prosecution, now bolstered by new evidence and public scrutiny, outlined the next steps of the case. Yet Janelle noticed how certain officials hesitated to commit their statements, couched in careful language designed to protect their own positions. It was a subtle dance of preservation, of waiting to see which way the scales would tip. As the proceedings continued, Janelle's mind raced. She couldn't let them rewrite the narrative, couldn't let the system wash its hands clean by sacrificing two scapegoats while the true architects of corruption retreated into the shadows. She needed leverage, proof that went beyond courtroom testimonies and exposed the deeper rot. That night, she met with Rosa and her team in a dimly lit cafe, known for its discreet clientele. They sat in a back corner, their hushed conversation blending with the murmur of clinking glasses and low music. "There's more," Rosa said, her voice low. She slid a flash drive across the table. A source from the Attorney General's office leaked this: financial records, communications. It ties Blake and the judge to a network that includes senior officials and even some in federal oversight positions. Janelle's pulse quickened as she absorbed the implications. "This isn't just local corruption," she whispered. "It's systemic." Rosa nodded grimly. "If we move on this, it'll make enemies at every level. They'll come after you harder than before. They might even try to discredit the entire case." Janelle stared at the flash drive, feeling its weight despite its size. This was the proof she needed. But it was also a Pandora's box. Releasing it would shatter not just the reputations of a few individuals, it would expose the very machinery of injustice that had thrived for decades under layers of bureaucracy and complicity. She took a slow breath. Prepare everything. Cross-reference the data, verify the sources. We're not rushing this. If we're going to bring the truth forward, it has to be airtight. The team nodded, their expressions a blend of fear and determination. They understood the stakes. This wasn't just about Janelle anymore. It was about every victim whose voice had been silenced, every family torn apart by a system that protected its own. As they dispersed into the night, Janelle lingered in the cafe, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. She gazed out the window at the city's neon glow, the distant sound of sirens weaving through the night. The silence outside was deceptive, masking the undercurrent of change rippling through the streets. In that quiet, she found clarity. Change wasn't a grand proclamation or a dramatic confrontation. It was the relentless, quiet insistence on truth, on justice, even when the world tried to drown it out with silence. It was the courage to stand, to listen, to speak when necessary, and to let silence itself bear witness when words were not enough. The reckoning had begun, not with a roar, but with the quiet, unyielding steps of those who refused to be silenced. Janelle Rhodes was ready to walk that road, no matter how long it. The morning of the final hearing dawned with a sky painted in shades of steel gray, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Janelle Rhodes walked into the courthouse with measured steps, her heart a quiet drumbeat beneath her composed exterior. The city outside seemed to hold its breath, the streets unusually still, as if the very air anticipated the weight of decisions waiting to be made. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, every seat filled, cameras poised, and voices hushed to a tense silence. Eleanor Vasquez, the presiding judge, called the courtroom to order, her voice firm but calm. She wore the weight of her role with a gravity that filled the room. As Janelle stood before her, she felt the culmination of every moment that had brought her here, the whispers of doubt, the weight of silence, the undeniable power of truth. The evidence, once a trickle of suspicion, had become a flood that could not be contained. Names, numbers, signatures, all woven together into a tapestry of corruption too intricate to ignore. Across the aisle, Blake McCarthy sat pale and defeated his lawyer, offering whispered counsel that seemed to fall on deaf ears. His arrogance, once palpable, had dissolved into the thin air of inevitability. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, drawing every eye forward. After thorough review of the evidence Vasquez intoned, and in light of the compelling testimony and documentation provided, this court finds the defendants guilty of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and systemic corruption. Effective immediately, Officer Blake McCarthy's badge is revoked, and he is remanded into federal custody pending sentencing. A murmur rippled through the room. Blake's shoulders sagged, his face crumbling under the weight of realization. But Janelle's eyes did not linger on him. Her gaze shifted to the men and women seated in positions of authority, those who had enabled his crimes with silent complicity. The judge continued, her voice cutting through the tension. This court also acknowledges the broader implications of these proceedings. An independent federal oversight committee will be established to review all cases associated with the implicated parties, ensuring justice is not only served today, but moving forward. Janelle felt her breath hitch her chest, tightening with a mixture of relief and residual fear. This wasn't just about Blake. It was about every victim, silenced, every family shattered, every truth buried beneath layers of systemic deceit. And now, with the weight of judgment ringing through the halls, the silence had finally been broken. As the courtroom emptied, Janelle lingered for a moment, letting the gravity of the moment settle around her. Reporters surged forward, eager for statements, but she offered none. Instead, she walked out into the crisp air, the sun breaking through the clouds like a quiet promise of dawn. Around her, the city stirred not in chaos, but in something more powerful hope. Janelle knew the fight wasn't over. The journey ahead would be long filled with resistance and shadows of doubt. But today, justice had found its voice, and it spoke not in fury, but in the quiet, unshakable truth she had carried all along. Janelle Rhodes's journey was not one of revenge, but of justice. What began as a quiet, unassuming presence in a courtroom soon unraveled into a masterful confrontation with deep-rooted corruption. Her resilience, composure, and unwavering dedication to truth dismantled a system long fortified by silence and complicity. Janelle stood not merely as a witness, but as a catalyst, exposing the abuses of power represented by Blake McCarthy and the broader network of enablers. In the end, justice was served not with dramatic outbursts or fiery vengeance, but with calculated, undeniable proof of systemic failure. The final judgment saw corrupt figures stripped of their power and a path paved for real accountability. Yet Janelle's story is not just about a courtroom victory. It's about the resilience of those who choose truth over convenience, integrity over fear. The deeper lesson here is one we can all take to heart. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. The courage to stand against systemic wrongs often begins with one person's refusal to be silenced. Janelle's story teaches us that while the road to justice may be long and treacherous, persistence and integrity are powerful weapons. It reminds us that real change requires more than outrage. It requires evident strategy and an unshakable belief in doing what is right. In our own lives, whether we face workplace injustice, societal biases, or personal dilemmas, we can draw strength from Janelle's story. We must be vigilant, proactive, and brave enough to confront wrongdoing, no matter how daunting it seems. If you found Janelle's story inspiring, if it made you think, or if it touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your support fuels our mission to share powerful stories that inspire change. Together, we can amplify voices that need to be heard and continue telling stories that matter.